Good morning and welcome to iSelect's Industry Overview webinar series. My name is Tom Bunn. I'm an associate on the iSelect Fund Ventures team, and I'm excited to walk you through today's presentation and findings. For those new to these webinars, iSelect is an early stage venture capital firm in St. Louis, Missouri, focused primarily on early stage companies in healthcare and agriculture. At iSelect, we are privileged to live at the forefront of innovation, seeing emerging problems, solutions, and trends at their beginning before they make their way into popular culture. We use these webinar presentations not only as a way for us to better engage with and understand new science and technology, but also to engage with the experts and entrepreneurs who are driving change and innovation in their respective fields. With the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, this deep dive is dedicated to discussing the problems in the healthcare industry in light of the pandemic. While there is very little good to be said about this situation, our hope with this webinar and the one on May 20th covering food and agriculture is to focus on how we can not only recover from this pandemic, but make healthcare and food and agriculture better and stronger than it was prior to the crisis. Given the immediacy of the situation, it has acted as an unprecedented pressure test on how to incorporate technology in different aspects of care, how to keep in touch with patients when they can't come into the clinic, and how to make complex decisions that require coordination in real time with uncertain data between different specialists. So today I've prepared a few slides with areas that need our collective focus and have a panel of industry experts who will take some questions. But the idea is to hear everyone's thoughts. So please do ask questions and let us know your thoughts for everyone on the call this morning. A few process comments before we get started. We are not soliciting investment or giving investment advice in any way whatsoever. This presentation is general industry research based on publicly available information. Again, we've invited you to this because you are technologists, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, industry experts, early adopter customers, or sophisticated investors that are part of our network. Again, we value your thoughts and questions and comments, so please do unmute yourself. If you have a question or comment or want to chime in, please don't be bashful. Finally, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for replay. With that, I'm pleased to bring you this week's webinar on COVID-19's long-term impact on healthcare. So what we're going to do, I'm going to introduce the guest panel and rather let them introduce themselves a little bit, and talk about some focus areas that I think are increasingly in the limelight for change and some problem areas that have been highlighted with this pandemic. And then we're going to open it up for general Q&A. I have some further questions that would love to dive into, but I know we have a smart attendee list, so please do ask questions as you see fit. So the guest panel today, we have Jarrett Glasscock, Chris Palmer, Sean Thompson, and Kim Wagner. I'm going to let each of them briefly introduce themselves. Jarrett, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure thing. Jarrett Glasscock. My formal training and background is a geneticist. I spent my time about 10 years working on the Human Genome Project. After that project, left to form Cofactor Genomics, where I serve as a CEO today. And Cofactor is focused on developing a new generation of diagnostics to inform healthcare. Specifically, we do a lot of work in informing cancer care.
Sean Thompson, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'm happy to go ahead. Hi, everyone. Sean Thompson. My background is in neuroscience, undergrad, then went into the pharmaceutical industry as a clinical trialist at SmithKline Beecham, then led the Canadian team for Tamiflu at Roche from phase 1 right through to marketing. Then worked at a biotech company as the head of clinical research and then the head of business development for 10 years. That company was acquired by Gilead. And then more recently, I founded SciGriff, a professor at the University of Guelph, which is about an hour west of Toronto. It's a nano delivery company. So we have a technology to deliver biomolecules to living cells that is derived from plant material. And we're working with that in a number of industries, and more recently are turning our attention to COVID-19 as an opportunity.
Thank you, Sean. Kim Wagner, would you mind giving an introduction?
So I'm Kim Wagner, currently founder of TBGD Partners. My educational background, my PhD is in pharmacology, so I should be doing all of the IND-enabling ADME tox studies. I consulted in the pharmaceutical industry and biopharmaceutical industry for about 25 years as part of a major management consulting firm. And then more recently, I have been helping startups, mostly actually in the food, nutrition, and agricultural space.
Great, thank you, Kim. And just reverting back to Dr. Palmer.
I'm an assistant professor of emergency medicine and critical care at Washington University in St. Louis. I work at Barnes Hospital, and I'm also the medical director for the telehealth program for emergency medicine, as well as our ICU telemedicine program. And I'm also an investor and on the board for OmniCure, which is a kind of like Uber for critical care, where in a mobile platform, we're able to connect critical care physicians to bedside providers on demand across the world, essentially, at a moment's notice. So that's what we're focused on from the telehealth industry.
Great. Well, that's a great segue into our first topic here. Obviously, with COVID-19, patients are limited, so it's an opportune time for telehealth to really take center stage. Telemedicine isn't new. It's actually been around for about 25 years. And it seems like every year folks in the industry are saying this is going to be the year. But 2020, in fact, truly is the year for telehealth. And historically, the problem is that it hasn't been fully accepted by patients, providers, or payers. But with this crisis, obviously, things have changed. And importantly, some regulations have eased. So in March, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services agreed to pay for virtual visits at the same rate as in-person visits. While the coronavirus emergency remains in effect. Mostly private insurers have followed suit. Also, the Office of Civil Rights has stated that it will not impose penalties for basically non-compliance with non-compliance with HIPAA with some technologies. So that's really eased the use of using things like FaceTime or Zoom or WhatsApp. Still can't use Facebook Live or Instagram Live, obviously, or TikTok, if that's your thing. But increasingly off-the-shelf technologies are able to be used in the area of telemedicine. Telemedicine, from my research, it's seen some rapid adoption. So the Health System Ascension facilities in 20 states says that its online care increased nearly 2,000% to about 10,000 visits in March from about 500 in earlier months. Common Spirit Health, which operates in 21 states, says its virtual care doubled about every 7 days, up to 33,000 televisits for the week ending April 3rd. And more data points like that. You can see at the bottom there's a graph showing a poll result for consumers, either historical use of telemedicine or their intention to try it. So I guess we have a few telemedicine experts on the call. I'm wondering if we can get some firsthand evidence on kind of how it's being used. Are there any issues with adoption currently? And if you're seeing any other factors that are either helping or hindering the adoption of telemedicine. Dr. Palmer, you want to take that one?
Sure. I don't have the exact statistics for Barnes Jewish Hospital and Washington University, but those statistics that you just described seem fairly accurate for basically what I would think we are seeing. Our telehealth visits, I would say in the clinic setting, probably we're in the hundreds, and now over the course of the past 6 weeks are certainly in the many, many thousands. And there is now a robust telehealth presence for our outpatient clinics. And, I like to tell people that, it's never going away. We're never going back to how we used to practice healthcare. We've really launched into the digital health era. And, we've always been kind of starting to focus more on value-based healthcare instead of fee-for-service, which is, really more patient-centered and focusing on the convenient care for patients. And telehealth really delivers on that. In my particular field of emergency medicine and critical care, we haven't been doing any telehealth from an emergency medicine perspective until this COVID-19 crisis, where we, within a matter of a few weeks, set up a telehealth platform where we have been able to screen patients and basically offer a virtual emergency medicine waiting room of sorts to screen COVID patients on demand wherever they are, mostly at their homes, so that we can prevent them from coming to the emergency room physically in order to prevent them from hopefully becoming infected with COVID. So that's really kind of changed our entire operation. And similarly to the outpatient clinic type visits, I don't really ever see this concept going away. And I think it's tremendously exciting for us both in emergency medicine and critical care. The issues are and will always remain the simplicity of being able to connect with patients. And I would certainly say the biggest issue is the elderly population, who still, I think, did not necessarily grow up with technology. And so they're just not as facile with using mobile phones and laptops and iPads, et cetera. So we still certainly have issues connecting virtually with audiovisual connection to patients in that manner. And having a telehealth operation that's device agnostic is also somewhat of a challenge. So there's still platform issues, there's technology issues, but once we do connect, we can about 99% of the time offer almost the same kind of care, or at least direct them to where they need to go.
Got it. Thanks for that.
Tom, can I ask a question real fast?
Please.
I mean, you were getting right onto the issue I was sitting here wondering about is the infrastructure. So corollary to the rise of telemedicine and telehealth, you're going to see pediatricians' offices, your regular doctors' offices. They're going to start declining, disappearing, and being acquired by larger hospital systems, which is a trend that was already happening. What type of infrastructure changes, are going to be necessary, and what type of labor force changes are going to be necessary to enable telemedicine and accommodate the loss of those other ways of providing healthcare that we've relied on in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly see the hospital staffing for the standard clinics and emergency medicine being significantly de-escalated. We're kind of furloughing, and some providers are being laid off currently. It's ironic during a pandemic that actually the hospital systems themselves are hurting, but we're not seeing the volume both in the physical space of the clinics and the hospitals. So that is going to change the workforce labor, because telehealth is a force multiplier. And so now I'm able to kind of see more patients than I kind of previously was. And so technically we actually need less providers. It's more cost effective for the hospital to have obviously less providers. The infrastructure is, and the bandwidth capabilities from the technology is challenging. I mean, I certainly think with improved broadband connectivity and 5G, that is really going to help improve connectivity and some challenges there.
And you talked about device agnostic. Does that mean even going back to as far as the Fitbit and the Apple Watch and gathering information from there to help you and as you diagnose and treat people?
So I was probably focusing a little bit more on like Google phone versus Android versus Apple, and having platforms that can kind of cross over those different smartphones without issue. But certainly, and I didn't get into this, but yes, what you're speaking of kind of with Apple Watches, et cetera, I refer to that as remote patient monitoring. And that's certainly also going to be a game changer in terms of assisting physicians being able to monitor patients at the point of first contact. So our biggest issue currently with telehealth is we don't have our ability to get a good, accurate set of vital signs on patients. But with devices such as that, pulse oximetry, respiratory rate, blood pressure, EKGs, all these things are coming out very quickly from a technology perspective, and remote patient monitoring will just facilitate us being able to do our job that much easier.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry, Tom, I jumped in.
No problem. That's great, Dr. Palmer. Thank you for that. So some questions that I still have, and I think that remain to be seen. I think this isn't probably an inflection point for telemedicine, and it might not be going anywhere. But obviously, the HIPAA compliance issue could increase in its importance. Obviously, not necessarily going to be using Zoom or FaceTime or WhatsApp going forward. Another question that I had that I think still remains to be seen is what happens to asynchronous telehealth and how that is perceived by payers. So if doctors are texting with their patients, will that be covered in a value-based system? It seems like it might. But then you go a step further with chatbots. So increasingly chatbots are important because it actually helps the doctors, from my understanding, triage patient care, and increasingly is offering, good prescriptions and good recommendations for some patients. So there's a lot of unknowns as far as to how far the acceptance will extend in terms of functionality and telehealth. And I know Kim and I spoke last week. She was a little bit more bearish on the prospect of telehealth. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Kim, but she thought that one of the key areas is going to be within the hospital, especially in pandemic situation when you have limited PPE and you're trying to limit exposure to a pathogen. So things like tablets or iPads in the hospital or in the clinic. Kim, do you have any follow-up, or did I completely misquote you there?
Well, so let me just pivot a little bit. What I see as the big benefit going forward is, I live in a rural area. I understand the challenges of rural healthcare. And in a situation like this, your local hospital may not have an ICU bed, point blank, or it might have one. And so the idea of being able to connect academic medical centers and more sophisticated hospitals with rural community hospitals in this kind of a setting, I think could be quite important. And if I think about this Kawasaki-like side effect that's starting to appear in children, there have been tens of cases like this in the New York City area. I don't know if there's been one in Iowa, but even in a sophisticated Des Moines hospital, somebody may very quickly want to be consulting with a physician on the ground in another city. So I see that in this situation and in other situations like it to be quite valuable. My reason for being a little bearish on telemedicine in general is partly because it takes a lot for me to go to a physician in the first place. And so I've already done the initial triage, and anything, that I could imagine I would need a physician for, they're going to be able to, they have to physically touch me. I can't show them something or describe it. And so I think, it's not going to totally replace the in-person visit with a physician. You can't stitch up a finger or set an arm on the phone.
Tom, we have a question from Al Edwards in the Q&A.
Okay, my question is, what will happen to underserved populations where internet and other electronic technologies are not available, either due to poverty or distance issues in rural areas?
Yeah, I certainly think that is a challenge. I mean, one thing that we do see quite frequently, at least in the emergency department, is most patients who are in, the depths of poverty have smartphones and have internet connectivity. The rural areas are challenging, and they do seem to have more coverage, it seems, every day. We also, we do provide rural telehealth services currently, and I'll echo, Kim's statements, at least from the rural America standpoint, that's a big focus of what we do at Barnes in terms of our Tele-ICU. We cover over 300 patients in rural areas within Missouri and provide those consulting services and get as best as we can out to those patients who don't necessarily have the expert specialist physicians. And if there is not connectivity for those patients, if they can go to their local clinic or emergency room or something to that effect where there is connectivity, they can still then get access to those specialists in urban centers. And so it is not a perfect solution, but with the ubiquitous nature of smartphones and the improving connectivity of internet connections every year, it becomes less and less of a challenge, in my opinion.
Great. Well, moving on, this is the next area I'm going to cover is related. It's wearable and connected devices. And I think there are two ways to look at this. You have kind of the big marquee front and center technology companies like Apple and Google taking a leadership position. And then there's the hundreds and thousands of potential wearable technologies, both for kind of in-home use and more of a clinical grade type of use. But starting with the kind of marquee tech players, I think this is important. On April 29th, they launched Apple and Google launched the first phase of their COVID-19 contact tracing. So this uses Bluetooth to analyze patterns of infected patients and alerts anybody who might have come in contact with those infected patients. Obviously, there's some privacy concerns around this. The company has vowed that they plan to only allow public health authorities to use the technology. And I think they came out yesterday and said that they're not doing location tracking for this as well, or not constant location tracking. Then there are the thousands of healthcare wearables behind Apple and Google that are projected to keep increasing at a CAGR about 30% by 2025. So this includes blood pressure monitors, continuous glucose monitors, pulse oximeters. iSelect has a couple investments here. One is called Readout, but this is a breath analysis device, clinical grade accuracy for measuring blood ketone levels. Their CEO couldn't join us this morning and falls into the kind of the healthcare home wearables, home care market. Then we have another called Nix, which is at first glance, kind of a hydration company, measures hydration, but in reality it's a biosensor company, and their long-term value is pretty high. So they have hydration management. You think of elder care being a demographic that's underserved in this crisis. Hydration is very important. Onset management treatment for chronic kidney disease, sickle cell, diabetes. For sickle cell anemia, dehydration is very important. So there's an increasing use of connected and home care devices that I think are probably having a similar heyday that telehealth is having. I would ask anybody, especially those in the panel or otherwise, kind of what they think about this market, if you think this is indeed an inflection point, and what the biggest impediment to kind of wide scale adoption of these technologies are.
Tom, this is Paul Lebo. I would also add that I think this whole situation is going to drive more point of care diagnostic testing. And what has to happen for all of this to work is it has to be rigorously evaluated and validated in terms of the data. We don't want to have a lot of monitoring and testing out there that's subpar. But I think this is going to be the impetus to do that, and for the FDA and other regulatory bodies to pay attention to the need for point of care monitoring. Otherwise, the telemedicine is going to be one hand held behind your back if you don't have the good data coming from the remote monitoring devices and point of care diagnostics.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that. I always think of it as garbage in is garbage out. And a lot of these remote patient monitoring wearables that we've been looking at for at-home monitoring, we've had to nix because, we would compare them to our, standard pulse oximeters, and there would be an app or there'd be some sort of wearable that would measure it. And, the readings would be significantly off to the point where I could not trust the readings that I was getting. So I think the biggest limitation for these will certainly be the accuracy of the data. I couldn't agree more with point of care testing in terms of the future and the need for that. But I do think that wearables will have a huge moment and a huge growth coming up here. And a lot of the things that we're doing as well from the telemedicine perspective, trying to really establish more in this global national crisis in order to treat patients outside the hospital, like in New York City, where there has been a crisis. You're setting up tents and you're having, just challenging roles for crisis management, that you can use wearables and different things like that in order to achieve the same level of care. But the accuracy of the data is tremendously important.
This is Kim. Maybe I'll take us in a completely different direction, which is wearables as a substitute for medicine versus wearables as a business investment. I will have to say that in the folks that I've been talking to over the last, 8 weeks of sequestration, if you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or healthy 70s and 80s, comorbidities are now front and center for the average American. And not only being able to control them, but realizing that even if it's a controlled comorbidity, you are a controlled diabetic, controlled high blood pressure patient, the fact that you have that comorbidity is making you susceptible, not whether or not you're taking care of yourself from a healthcare perspective. And so taking personal focus on improving one's health and the underlying cause of disease, so focusing on wellness as opposed to healthcare, I think is going to be huge. And therefore, I think that individuals will be buying more of these things and using them for more purposes than anybody anticipates. So while it may not be a good substitute for telemedicine, I think it's going to be a great investment from an investable thesis perspective. I'll give you one example. I was on a webinar recently, and it was focused on athletics and athletes getting, to that third and fourth order benefit from their nutrition plan. And they were actually suggesting that you get a glucose monitor, because they had figured out an algorithm that if you look at your, the feed off of what is being used as a glucose monitor for a type 2 diabetic, you can actually fine tune your nutrition relative to when you're working out and how you're working out. So I just think these things are going to take off. Whether or not it's good medicine is different than whether or not it's good business.
It's a fair point, Cam. I appreciate that. And Sean, I think that's related to a lot of your core work. You're kind of on the front lines of wellness. What are you seeing in terms of any shifts that you've seen, even in the truncated last 6 weeks, around your prospects for growth in the overall wellness or preventative medicine space?
I would certainly agree with what Kim has said. People are more interested in taking control of their health in many ways, from a nutrition and technology. So I agree with what she's saying about individuals buying these products and showing greater interest, and I think that trend is accelerating. I think the issue from the public health point of view is integrating those data into the overall database for public health, and can they use it? So, back when I was at Roche, we had a point of care diagnostic for influenza, and the CDCs around the world, because I was a global program, were very concerned about the quality of our data and getting it to them in a timely fashion. So I think that's still a bridge to be crossed to integrate all that. But from our perspective, we've been working in the food industry to deliver nutrients, increase the bioavailability of nutrients from plants in people's diets with our food powder. And we're getting a lot of interest from various players to advance that product, and to also include other nutrients in our offerings. And then also, I would say, I'm drifting a bit into the pharma industry, but we have been discussing the possibility of developing therapeutics and vaccines with our technology well into the future. And the COVID-19 crisis has rapidly advanced that thinking. So that's a major focus of ours, to create oral therapeutics for COVID-19. So a lot of doors have been opened for us in the last 6 to 8 weeks.
Great, thanks, Sean. We're going to come back to a little bit on the biotech, biopharma development and what this means for that side of the industry. So let's hold off on that a little bit, but we want to dive deep into it in just a second. But I think what you mentioned around how you transfer that data into the overall health system is another great segue into my next slide here about EHRs. EHRs are electronic health records. Over the past decade, billions of dollars has been spent in switching from paper to electronic health records. And the idea here is that they document every step doctors or healthcare workers take in treating a patient. But they have been widely criticized even before COVID-19, but at least what I'm seeing is that the crisis has really underscored some of the inherent problems in EHRs and some of the competitive pressures and siloed data systems that the big EHR vendors are incentivized to have. So you can see on the right there, a doctor from a hospital in Boston, I believe. He says, I know many have commented on this, but why are nearly all notes in Epic EHR basically useless to understand what's happening to the patient during hospital course? Other criticisms I've heard are that they abjectly cut into patient care. So you're seeing one-to-one hours of data input to hours with patients. Would be interested to hear Dr. Palmer's perspective on if that's true. That's just one anecdotal data point. Would love to hear another and understand from your perspective if these EHR pain points I've read about really are in fact so problematic.
Yeah, I would say it's a love-hate relationship with EHRs. We use Epic, and we just transitioned to Epic within the past year or two, and it was incredibly challenging. And our hospital system lost millions and millions of dollars, switching over during that time due to the inefficiencies. But over time, your efficiency improves with the EHR, and there will always be roadblocks being able to kind of integrate and connect care. However, as more and more hospital systems are kind of uniting under similar platforms, and especially with Epic, I am now able to kind of see what my patients where they've been across the nation over the past, however many years. I just saw somebody the other day that moved from North Carolina, and they suggested that they were in the hospital there for a week or something. And, I was able to read all their notes in their hospital system in North Carolina that I never would have been able to do before. And so some roadblocks are still there. Some have decreased. There is the phenomenon of note bloat, which is what I believe that physician is referring to, where, there's just hundreds of notes that you have to kind of, sift through in order to find what you're looking for. But they're focused on ways to improve that. So that is a challenge. But, certainly CMS is definitely trying to make it better, where they're focusing on less time documenting and more time with patients. But that is currently also a huge challenge, as we cannot perform our jobs without the documentation because we don't get paid. And so there's so much focus on making sure you click all the right buttons to get paid, that you spend less time connecting with your patients and forming that doctor-patient relationship that's so valuable.
So on the telehealth front, are you just, after a telehealth visit, are you just manually entering in the data from memory into the EHR?
That's correct. You can do it simultaneously, but you can also just do it afterwards. It's similar. It's just like, regular patient visit. I'd go to see you, and then after the visit, I'd go back to my computer and document.
Got it. Jarrett, in Cofactor, with Cofactor's research, are you guys pulling in any data from EHRs at this point?
Absolutely. This has probably been one of our biggest pain points over the last year. I think there's this assumption that when you're working with hospitals, and we work with dozens of hospitals with our studies, and quite frankly, I was pretty surprised as we engaged with some of the top tier hospitals, where I saw, budget line items where we were paying for individuals to go through and look through the paper documents, the paper folders on each patient in order to get, key data that we needed for our study, the outcomes, the treatment, the medicines that they were on, certain aspects. And I think I had gone into this process thinking, oh, well, of course, these top tier institutions will all have this information standardized. They'll have it in electronic records. But I think, it was quite surprising on, this aspect of interoperability between EHRs for those folks that did have EHRs in place. And quite frankly, I was surprised how many places were not using EHRs or had not switched over to digital. And I think, like many things that we're talking about today, there's this kind of pressure testing and things that happen where you realize certain aspects of healthcare, haven't changed since the 1950s. And so, yeah, this is to answer your question. This definitely affects us, and I think there'll be aspects in terms of needs, from healthcare institutions, from companies like ours, from patients, and those needs will be forcing functions, to get all of this, online and done the right way and up to speed.
Got it. Yeah, I guess, from my perspective, trying to look for startups that can wedge their way in between the 800-pound gorillas of Epic and Cerner. What I'm thinking about in terms of startups that might have a chance in this market, software systems that really give patients agency over their own health records. At the end of the day, the P in HIPAA actually stands for portability, not privacy. I think it's often mistaken for that. And patients legally have a lot of agency and have a lot of should have a lot of oversight into how this data is being used. Obviously, that becomes a little tricky when you're talking about huge troves of data sets for research. But another area I think that could be good is a company like MD Clone. They're an Israeli company. They're making synthetic data sets that are virtually identical to the original data, but the all identifying information can't be traced back to the individual patients. So those are a couple of my thoughts in terms of angles that startups can take to wedge themselves in this market. Any other ideas where we should be looking in terms of how to make this industry better?
It's Carter for a second. I just want to insert one thought here, a flip the switch thought is, if in fact we could get rid of the HIPAA regime and get patients to realize they control their data and make that one switch, does that shift allow a lot of business models to shift? I mean, we act like HIPAA was this big thing that's immovable, but it's really movable if the human decides that they're willing to move their data around. Does that solve a lot of the problems?
This is Buddy Lyons.
Hey, buddy. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we have another company, Dash Analytics, that sort of addresses this issue. And we thought when we started Dash that we develop some modules that were what they do at the point of care. They predict downstream adverse events like a surgeon in real time predicting whether or not a patient will have a surgical site infection or whether a patient has delirium. But we thought when we started the company that it was going to be, the IP was going to be involved in the modules themselves, their AI machine learning modules. But what we found is the IP is really in our ability to extract data and manipulate data from the EHR. I mean, the what we hear from doctors too, I mean, EHRs, the history of EHRs is they were really not so much developed to improve patient care as they were for reimbursement and litigation. And I think that is still the mindset of Epic, Cerner, and the rest of them, because they leave them as very closed systems and they want it to be that way. And if you're going to manipulate the data, they're trying to force vendors like us into using, data's apple orchard and all these sorts of things. So until we get to a point to where these are more open systems, this is going to be a big problem. And the EHR providers have such a stranglehold on the market that it makes it difficult to make advances in using that data. I mean, you think of the amount of data that could be used by physicians from an AI or machine learning standpoint to ease their burden and to be more accurate in treating their patients. It's astounding. However, we have such difficulty getting to the data. We spent 2 years developing a scalable platform in order to be able to do that. And it's just not widely available out there. So and there's lots of people working on this, but still the bottleneck is going to be Epic and Cerner and McKesson and Allscripts about keeping the system closed and keeping a stranglehold on the data themselves. We were able to work around that quite effectively. But there are going to be some legal issues to come up with that as well. And so we are really hampering care providers by not being able to easily extract and manipulate the data that's already in there for those patients. We really are.
Carter, this is Jarrett Glasscock. I've seen something really interesting happen over the last year where a number of startups here in San Francisco, startups in St. Louis, startups in Chicago have been forming that are in this interesting space where they set up this kind of two-way marketplace between the healthcare data that is sitting, within hospital systems And then you have, either large pharma or startups that are trying to gain access to that data to do their studies and to do their development. And so there's been this kind of need for this kind of individual or this company that sits between, that is building systems that are HIPAA compliant, systems that have the correct security, and they really act as this intermediate in helping healthcare systems and hospitals really monetize the value of that data.
Yep.
And they really also help, entrepreneurs, companies, but also large pharma that are wanting to gain access and base developments off of that. So I think that's another factor which is interesting, which is going to drive some of these developments. And I think it almost requires this third entity that has this incentive to build a bridge, so to say.
Yeah. So I think, we look for durable, big, outsized return opportunities, and my sense is it's in this area. We sort of had this conversation around creating data sets for synthetic control arms. We've got a few different concepts around business models of, can you amalgamate failed pharmaceutical test data? The Israeli company that Tom mentions is interesting in terms of its ability to abstract, but practically you can still reverse engineer that information to get the patient data. It just doesn't, in terms of, you could still violate HIPAA with it, but I'm just getting to the point where I'm wondering, certainly I've told some people this, we're trying to work with some people in Congress to come up with a new definition of HIPAA that allows the individual to basically say, I'm okay to free this up. It feels like that we can make a break point in that, and over the next 3 or 4 years, maybe shift thinking around that to free up the data analytics. And if we free up the data analytics, even going to Tom's front end of this conversation in terms of diagnostic, we'd say, hey, how do you charge that point of care? Well, if the cost of delivering care starts to go to zero, why do you need to charge for it? So then the business models change, and then you don't need to worry about the HIPAA stuff on the front end. Telemedicine front end, dealing with initial patient care. If that cost starts going to zero and you can free up HIPAA at that level, can we sort of drive in an entrepreneurial way to sort of free up more of these systems and work back to the more complex systems? And so I'm sort of on that roadmap, and that feels like that's an outsized return. If we can figure out how to open and trigger that, that's a 80, 100x payoff for the company that can do that.
Well, let's keep going. This is great stuff. Maybe we can come back to this but this next slide, we can brush over this. This is basically me trying to lay out some evidence that underscores the tidal wave of data that's coming. So you see the average amount of data on the right generated over a person's lifetime. Small minority has been from clinical care. And if, what we say or what we project comes to pass with health behaviors, and obviously the exponential understanding we've had in non-modifiable factors like genetics, the point is that these EHRs will be increasingly bottlenecked, and the data isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's going to increase. So let's go into diagnostics a little bit. There's a lot to be said here. Since we're short on time, would love to get Jarrett's and perhaps Paul's opinions on where the best diagnostics will be coming from. We mentioned point of care and the importance that will take. There's recently been some news about CRISPR diagnostics. So not using a guide RNA to edit, but using a guide RNA to detect. And there are two companies on the bottom right here, Mammoth and Sherlock, that are interesting, relatively early stage, that have come to the fore over the last 6 weeks. But what else should we be looking at? What's around the corner in terms of diagnostics, and what are the most important things?
Well, we're going to defer a little bit to Jarrett, but what I would like to see, and I think is becoming more and more possible, is a sequence-based diagnostic, a rapid sequence-based diagnostic, whereby if there's a new syndrome and it looks infectious and it's behaving like a novel infectious disease, that we can do a sequence diagnostic in a very rapid way, and not have what we had during this COVID, a lag. I mean, it was a short lag in the scheme of things in terms of diagnostics, but there was a lag in terms of getting the right sequence information so we could develop an accurate PCR-based diagnostic. But the kind of technology that is being used by, what's the name of that company, Shield, I think, whereby you can sequence a sample very, very rapidly and then deconvolute that sample and apply it to a novel viral diagnostics. That would be a game changer from my perspective, because now that could be applied to any potential pandemic that's out there, and then could be used going forward as well as these sequence-specific diagnostics, whether it's CRISPR or PCR. But I'd be interested in Jared's attitude.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There's this trade-off usually between being very specific, and with that specificity gives you speed, as opposed to being comprehensive. And to kind of quote my chief scientific officer, he talks about opening up the iris. And when you open up the iris and you're able to take a more global approach of seeing everything that's there, that's usually a longer process and a more expensive process. So it's not really always an either or. Many times during the development of a diagnostic, you may take a more global approach and sequence quite a bit more than you actually need to. And then once you find out where those important factors are and what is the true signal, because that's always the challenge, is the signal from the noise, then there can be a second generation of a diagnostic, which is just focused on those signals and could be deployed and more rapidly and more cheaply. So I agree with you. And, my hope is, once we get out of the fire, so to say, here with what we're in, there will be more appreciation for diagnostics. And, many of the things that we've been talking about today has been kind of pressure testing. A situation like this has been pressure testing, what we currently have in place. And my hope is that it'll identify some of the, the shortcomings that have to be addressed. In terms of the things that I'm excited about in diagnostics, I think it'll be, things where there's an acute need because, something doesn't exist, or there's multiple therapies to choose from and you need the diagnostics to guide you. More and more, there's the financial implications that are coming in because of the inefficiencies of the way that healthcare is practiced. And diagnostics is really needed in order to put us back in a more sustainable, realistic, financial situation in terms of healthcare costs. So I think a lot of those types of things are where we focus our development at Cofactor is, what are the things that are an acute need and really need diagnostics. The last thing I'll say is I was at a really great meeting that I try to get to every year. It's a Precision Medicine Coalition meeting that happens in Boston. And this last year, Scott Gottlieb, the former commissioner of the FDA, was there. And there was something said during his session that really kind of summed it up. And what they said was, there's no precision medicine without precision diagnostics. And I really liked that statement that was said during that session. And I think in many cases that's very true.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Jared. So let's talk a little bit about biopharma and some changes and long-term effects there. You can see on the right, this is a NIH grants for coronavirus research. You can see in 2003 it began to peak or began to climb with the advent of SARS, and then like a bell curve, it kind of dipped again. And I imagine 2020 and 2021 we'll see a sharp increase again. And I think that's, I'm sure they said the same thing after SARS, but a greater focus on prevention and infectious disease therapeutics, including vaccines, seems to be an obvious result of this. The economics of developing vaccines is still uncertain, but it strikes me that that's probably going to be a long-term focus. Increased adoption of AI. You've seen some requests from the White House and the potential use of AI to go through, up to 40,000 machine readable articles about the virus. And I think there's going to be some regulatory flexibility, regulatory changes. Carter mentioned synthetic control arms. It seems like getting patients in for clinical trials is going to be increasingly difficult. So those could gain steam, as well as digital devices and use of those with clinical trials. But would be curious to hear other opinions on long-term effects in the biopharma industry as kind of a direct result of COVID.
So maybe I'll jump in there to kick off the discussion. You know, from my perspective, the way obviously there's a huge opportunity. There are you know, there are therapeutic approaches and vaccine approaches, and so the way I look at the opportunity is what is most critically needed. And if you look at the population who are dying, these are people who are immunocompromised in some way. And so that points to a therapeutic being the most urgent need, because these are the same folks that don't respond as well to vaccines. And then drilling down from, you know, therapeutics, where do you go? Do you go small molecule? Do you go antibody? Do you look at, say, RNA and DNA? And I would agree with the comments that were made about diagnostics are also applicable to biopharma. And really, RNA approaches are going to be the most successful, have the most, you know, highest probability of success. And so that's where we have focused, is looking at delivering RNA as a knockout punch to the virus itself, rather than relying on the host's immune system to mount a response, or to at least buy the host more time to mount a response. So that's where we're focusing. We've seen some opportunities there, and I would say, in addition to the U.S. government, every government around the world is pouring money into research for therapeutics and vaccines, and we're pursuing a lot of those opportunities ourselves.
This is Paul. I think that one of the things that this epidemic, this pandemic has demonstrated is how inefficient our whole clinical trials system is. It's a hodgepodge of different designs and evaluations, et cetera. And you have the people on the one hand that are advocating for getting a vaccine in 6 months, and others saying, we have never made a vaccine in 10 years, and part of this is because the clinical trials take a long time. And there's a lot of inefficiencies in the whole process that need to be streamlined, both with respect to how the trials are designed, but even more importantly is how they're evaluated and brought to the decision makers quickly. It all seems incredibly inefficient. It's really highlighted how long it takes to do things that don't have to be long. Some things just can't be done faster, but many aspects of the whole process could be improved.
Paul, how will that happen? It was actually fascinating. On Twitter, the Flatiron founder was talking that we needed to do more random control trials, which given what Flatiron does, I just sort of shocked me that he was saying that. But then if we look at China, are there other people without our sort of bureaucracy that are accelerating time to market? And is that an indication of where the world might go? Or are there people inside FDA that are advocating for a different shift that might get a voice? What's your sense?
Well, my perspective may be narrower than others, but I think that the biggest issue is clarity and harmonization of how trials are set up and evaluated. You can make it faster, but that doesn't necessarily make it better unless a lot of thought is put into how these trials are designed and evaluated. And the big opportunity here is AI, of course. There's a huge human element right now in how these trials are put together and how they're evaluated. And a lot of this could be done with algorithms as long as there was a will on the part of the FDA, et cetera, to participate in the development of these algorithms.
So put another way, so you're doing respiratory vaccines, and there are 20 that have been attempted in the last year, and there are 25 different trial methodologies that don't have any correlation between each other.
Exactly. I mean, they're loosely correlated. You know, when Fauci talks about what he thinks trial should be, et cetera, he's not operating from clarity in terms of the whole field is operating from the same playbook in terms of how that trial should be designed and what the endpoints should be and how it should be evaluated. And you saw how the remdesivir trial came out and was evaluated, and opinions were all over the board in terms of what that meant.
Yeah.
And it was because there was no harmonization in terms of how it was evaluated.
But who's going to make that happen?
I think it has to be an FDA industry collaboration. I think it has to be a task force that has to put this together. The FDA is not going to do it on its own. It needs industry input.
So I think it's tough to accelerate vaccine trial endpoints, because when you're testing a vaccine, you have to sort out the dosing schedule to provoke the immune response. That takes a certain period of time. And you have to evaluate how long that immune response lasts. And there's no way to really accelerate that. You know, if the vaccine doesn't last for 12 months, it's not a very useful vaccine. So whereas with a therapeutic, if you're trying to stop someone from dying or shorten their time in hospital or lower their viral load, your time to event is much shorter. So you can get a therapeutic developed much faster than you can a vaccine.
I totally agree. And in fact, the biggest issue with a vaccine is safety, because you're going to be giving it to a lot of healthy people, and a very, very low mortality rate when the vaccine is universal might kill more people than the disease. And it takes time. I fully understand that, but there's many aspects of the clinical trial process that can be made more efficient. But you're right, there are certain aspects, mostly the clinical aspects, that just take a certain amount of time. But on the other hand, the AIDS epidemic, in terms of therapeutics, really had a major positive effect on how clinical trials are done. And the biggest effect they had was to change from clinical endpoints to laboratory endpoints for efficacy. And there's a lot of things that could be done in the vaccine area with regard to efficacy and safety, for that matter, that could help quite a bit and give us information about to predict safety and efficacy before the clinical outcomes.
So I agree that the AIDS epidemic definitely changed things in how pharmaceuticals are developed, and that was a good thing. So, but yeah, I mean, absolutely, any way you can shorten timelines is great. But there's also, it's not just clinical; it's manufacturing issues. So you know, there was a lot of work done, as was previously noted, starting with the SARS outbreak in 2003. That stopped because the outbreak was contained. And then a lot of that work was restarted when MERS came along, and it stopped again because that was contained. So we actually have had a huge head start with this coronavirus because so much work had been done. But it's really, really tough. I mean, I'm looking at that now. Our product is simple to manufacture, and the payload is relatively simple to manufacture, but getting enough of it at the right quality and being able to test our hypothesis in a level 3 lab, it's almost impossible. There's only, you know, each country only has a few of these, and they're under such huge demand right now, it's really tough to make things go faster.
Is that just in terms of treatment? I mean, does that mean don't plan for? Well, I've already reached this conclusion. Don't plan for a vaccine.
I don't see how a vaccine can be here before the back half of next year. I mean, at the earliest.
Yeah.
So we're going to have treatments before that. And, remdesivir is useful. It does appear to be doing something. It's not a home run, but it's, I guess, similar to Tamiflu. Tamiflu is a treatment for influenza, but that did not negate the need for a vaccine. And there will be other treatments that come along sooner, but really novel things that people are starting that need to be tested in animal models. There's a huge bottleneck with that. It's not movable because you can't just create a level 3 lab where you can test aerosolized viruses in animals.
Yeah, this is Kim. I will just second everything that was said, and maybe add that I've had some conversations with individuals who are actually part of some of the big vaccine manufacturers programs, and without divulging confidential information, the people on the ground are like, even if we parallelize everything we can, even if we get every quote forgiveness possible from the FDA as far as acceleration, it's a 3-year timeline. It's normally a 5-year timeline. So taking, 2 years off of a 5-year timeline is actually pretty good. But, if you're a business and you're thinking about you need a vaccine in order to open up, then you need a much longer timeline than the end of 2020.
And it's still, we're talking about a respiratory vaccine, which in and of itself has high failure rate, right?
Right, and that's assuming that most things go well and there's a little glitches and that decisions are not made with a financial mindset, meaning you do a lot of stuff at risk, even if you wouldn't normally.
Yeah, and that's why governments are pouring so much money into this, into multiple parallel programs, because, we know in pharma, 95% of what we try that doesn't work, is not safe enough or not efficacious enough. So it's going to take huge amounts of money at risk and building plants, GMP facilities to manufacture the material completely on spec, because that takes a year to build and qualify a plant.
Yeah, I think the other thing to consider also, going back to the safety, is, it's one thing if you have a vaccine and, you give it to a test patient and there's an immediate reaction. Okay, you can kind of start taking things off the list. If there's some kind of, not a mortality, but a morbidity side effect that shows up 3, 4, 5 months after you get that vaccine, which is quite possible, that can completely, not only did you lose that particular candidate, but then you lost the incremental 4 or 5 months that you've been plowing into that candidate.
Yes, and that happens regularly in pharma. So I've been part of development programs where the efficacy is great, but a safety issue emerged once you got to 600-700 patients. You could see there's liver enzyme elevations in about 2% of the population, and there's no way to identify those patients in advance, and that's enough to kill the drug.
So thank you everyone for indulging us here for an extra few minutes. Would love to stay in touch about this. Perhaps we can schedule some calls over the next couple weeks. If you'd be interested, feel free to reach out, let us know how to get a hold of you. And please join us in 2 weeks for a similar approach to food and agriculture, where we will be talking about the long-term effects of COVID-19 on food and ag. This webinar is recorded. If you know anyone who might be interested in hearing it, let them know. You can share the link and they can register to take a look. So thanks again for everyone joining. Special thanks to the panel. You've been tremendously helpful, and hopefully we can continue the dialogue in the coming days and weeks.
Terrific. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.